Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hello, I'm Tricia Class, and today I'm talking with Ellis Hurd, Assistant Professor in the Curriculum and Instruction Department. Today we're talking about his article that combines his interest in middle-level education and issues related to students of mixed heritage. Welcome, Ellis.
Well, thanks for having me.
Could you discuss the context and problem that led you to do this study?
Sure. There were several factors that influenced the study. One is middle school students already have what we call a volatile identity. It goes in and out, back and forth, just due to the development of those kids. But those students who have a mixed identity experience that volatility even more because they find themselves in one or both or in between one or more races or cultures. And part of the influence of that is the way in which they identify will have vast effects on their educational performance. So naturally, I wanted to look at that. And Golnick and Chin in a recent study discuss how more than 4 of 10 students are students of color. And by the time we get to 2020, that's going to comprise nearly 50% of students, with 40% of the U.S. population in general being non-white. And yet, at the same time, the race of our current teachers neither matches that of the general population or of the students. So I think those factors heavily influence the study and the need to explore a middle school student's mixed identity.
And then you talk about the influence of Ogbu and others.
Right. And the reason Ogbu becomes so cornerstone in this study is that he discusses minorities basically fitting into 2 groups. But either group, the identities tend to be forced upon minorities, especially in school-to-school transitions. So those of mixed identity, also being minority, but of being possibly part of one or more minority groups, would have that same experience of having their identities being forced upon them. And the 2 splits that John talks about basically concern those who are voluntary minorities, or immigrant, if you will, minorities, versus those who are non-voluntary minorities. The voluntary minorities are those who have come to the United States for increased political or socio-political or economic or monetary benefits. And they've chosen to come here, and even though they recognize the struggles of being a minority, they see it as temporary, and they usually can assimilate very easily. On the other hand, those who are involuntary became Americans through conquest or colonization or through slavery, and so they tend to see the United States as an adversary. Yet they're here enjoying the privileges of the country at the same time, but they have what Ogbu talks about as an oppositional identity, and so they resist a lot of times the dominant norms, and they oppose those. So that was a large influencer as the background of the study and where a minority student especially of mixed identity may be approaching his or her own identity.
Could you focus on what you found out about the relationship of schooling to mixed self-identity?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, students that do identify as mixed or having a mixed identity, that has a vast effect on their educational performance. And the themes that emerged from this study concerned 3 concurrent themes. One is the social disaffection that Nick had as a result of his mixed identity. The second is that just the encounters that he had in the school. And the third were his identity navigations and how he, if you will, navigated the environment as a result of it. But those 3 current themes really pointed to a larger idea taking place, and that was this interrelated homily, pain and privilege. What I saw with Nick, basically, was this presence of privilege, the fact that he was unique. He was Honduran, and yet also American. He could speak Spanish, yet he spoke English well, and he was able to transcend his own culture as a Honduran and the other cultures that existed in his town, but not transcend his own culture, and at the same time be pegged against it. And so he explains how in school he was unique because he had high achievement. He came from a prestigious bilingual school in Honduras, and he was accustomed to using both languages fluently. But the teachers were surprised at his progress because they weren't used to that. And his friends even more were surprised. And part of that disaffection came when he realized he was losing friends as a result of being smart and being a high achiever. So he then would perform more poorly on purpose in order to identify with a certain group. And that was in terms of academics. In terms of culture or race, there were times times that he couldn't find anyone that would mirror back to him his own mixed identity. And so he would identify with the dominant minority group at the time, which was Mexican. And so he was neither Mexican, nor did he see himself as quote-unquote brown, but yet he found himself unable to identify with anyone else really. And so he chose to identify with that. But at times he could also choose to identify as white or as American, being mixed. And so he was able to enjoy the access and the privileges that were afforded to that person who could transcend and then do that at the same time. He felt fearsome, uncomfortable, lonely, and he was caught between his identity and his heritage.
Understanding students of mixed identity, the simultaneous interplay of pain and privilege, which seems like that is what you're saying is a very effective lens for future research. Can you really explain that concept?
This was part of a larger study, and I referenced that in the article. I look at this dichotomous pain-privilege discourse in relation to my own identity, which I had done, but yet this interrelated discourse doesn't appear in the literature. And the closest thing that we have to it is very limited research that is on the intricacies of identity, and it comes from some such as Anzalduya from O'Connor back in the 80s, and even further back to an author by the title of Simons Bonine, her Indian name being Zitkala, but from the 1890s. And so those studies are few and in between, and they don't really look at adolescence specifically. So the discourse is important to look at because we tend to neglect that complex dichotomy. We tend to just explore it from one angle or another, not realizing that both lenses need to be explored, that the interrelated discourse needs to be considered in the research. And with regards to being painful, he was privileged in that he could obviously identify with the dominant group, but at the same time, he couldn't completely identify with them. And the same is true for his other identity. He couldn't completely identify as a Honduran, but he couldn't completely identify as an American. So he could not become encapsulated within his own identity. He fit into both, yet neither one at the same time. And that was a painful experience. And the same existed in terms of the pain that he saw in environmental racism, as Ballard talks about, this concept of living in a certain part of town and only being afforded certain privileges as a result of his race or his culture. Same thing saw at the school. And so that was the painful aspect. The privilege aspect at the same time is that he is able to change and negotiate his identity, since he is also simultaneously American or white. And he then was able to transcend this painful experience. And because of his lighter skin, which was one of the factors influencing it, he could identify with the dominant culture. He could transcend, even resist Western racism as a result of being able to jump into the other group. And so we see this privilege in that he's able to negotiate his identity and travel between different groups and different self-identifications to experience that access and that privilege.
You also had a nice table in the beginning that shows all the different views and different heritages, both North and South America, about all the possible combinations and some of the pejorative terms for it, as well as more neutral terms.
And the fascinating thing about that table is that it proves that these issues transcend just America, or transcend the rural area that this study was done in, or that it obviously transcends the area that it could be applied to in terms of more urban areas. This occurs in other countries, even countries with high percentages of those that are mixed. That same pain-privilege dichotomy exists in that some people are able to gain access because they have a mixed identity or certain privileges afforded to them because they're lighter skin tone or they have a better use of the language versus those that don't, that may have a darker skin tone or less command of a language one way or another, and therefore are relegated to inferior positions because of that. And I came up with 5 things that are seen in the identities of other mixed heritage students. And the 5 create a framework, if we will, for when we do further research in this area. The first is that adolescents of mixed identity construct and deconstruct their identities as a result of social systems that exist. That they're socio-political and they're also cultural, ecological descriptions of power, position, constantly influencing who they are and who they become. And let me pause with number 2 there and say, someone may ask, didn't I just underplay race? Didn't I really just underplay socioeconomic status? Is this really about identity? And I think we would all agree that our total experiences make up who we are and how we may identify, our affective identity in that case. So they are there and constantly developing who we are. Number 3, students of mixed identity find they cannot fully identify with a singular race, culture, or social class due to those societal fragmentations. Number 4, mestizo adolescents bear the insinuations of the past for how their particular identity descriptors have come to exist. And finally, they experience that pain and privilege by traveling between and negotiating within their racial, cultural, and social groups and oppositional identities.
I hope today's conversation will encourage others to check out your article and post. Thank you so much for today's conversation.
Thank you.
The full citation for today's article is Hurd, 2012, A Framework for Understanding Multicultural Identities, an investigation of a middle-level student's French-Canadian, Honduran-American, mestizo identity, from the Middle Grades Research Journal, Volume 7, Number 2, pages 111 to 127. This citation can also be found at coe.ilstu.edu/research/podcast. Thank you and join us for future research breaks.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.